On the glistening surface of Manhattan's high society, some lives shine brighter than others. Richard and Eleanor Sterling were the sun and the moon, a power couple who had it all. He was the king of high-stakes real estate, a titan of industry. She was his elegant, intelligent queen, the silent architect of his empire. For 25 years, their life was a masterpiece of wealth and success. But what happens when the masterpiece is a forgery? What happens when the king decides he wants a new queen, discarding the old one like a forgotten relic? He thought he held all the power, all the money, all the control. He was about to learn a lesson worth $100 million. The air in the Sterling's Fifth Avenue penthouse was always thick with the scent of money and white calla lilies. Tonight it was particularly potent. It was the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, a night where New York's elite gathered to write seven-figure checks and admire Richard and Eleanor Sterling, the city's reigning power couple. Richard Sterling, with his silver-streaked hair and a smile that could close any deal, moved through the crowd like a shark in his element. He was the founder of Sterling Global Properties, a man who didn't just build skyscrapers, but reshaped skylines. At his side, as always, was Eleanor. At 48, she possessed a quiet, arresting beauty that brand-name glamour couldn't buy. Dressed in a midnight blue Chanel gown, she was the epitome of grace, the perfect hostess, the supportive wife. She laughed at the right jokes, remembered the names of everyone's children, and made every guest feel like the most important person in the room. To the outside world, they were a fortress of marital success. But for the last year, Eleanor had felt a subtle tremor in the foundation. It was in the way Richard now held his phone angled away from her, the screen always dark when she entered a room. It was the late nights at the office that had become all-nighters. It was the sudden interest in SoulCycle classes, and a younger, more aggressive style of bespoke suit from Tom Ford. "Darling, you're a vision," Richard murmured, his hand resting on the small of her back. His touch felt performative. It was for the benefit of Senator Thompson, who was standing in front of them. "You're too kind," Richard. Eleanor replied, her smile perfectly calibrated. "We're just so thrilled with the turnout for the children's literacy program." Later that evening, after the last guest had departed and the clatter of the catering staff echoed from the kitchen, Eleanor stood on their terrace overlooking the glittering expanse of Central Park. Richard joined her, loosening his bow tie. "Another triumph, my love," he said, kissing her on the cheek. The kiss was cold, a mere formality. "We raised over $5 million tonight. It's wonderful," she said, her voice soft. She wanted to ask, "Where were you last Tuesday? Who is Chloe? Why does her name appear on our Amex Black Card statement for a $15,000 shopping spree at Bergdorf Goodman?" But she couldn't. The words felt like broken glass in her throat. Voicing the suspicion would make it real, and she wasn't ready to shatter their perfectly curated world. Richard had been her entire life since she was 23. She wasn't just a socialite. She had a master's in architecture from Columbia. In the early days, it was her eye for design and her uncanny ability to spot undervalued properties that gave Sterling Global its first big breaks. He was the dealmaker, she was the visionary. Together, they were unstoppable. But over the years, as their son Liam and daughter Olivia were born, and the company grew into a behemoth, she had stepped back, taking on the role of mother hostess and foundation chair. A role she loved, but a role that had slowly rendered her invisible in the corporate machinery she had helped build. Richard, however, never forgot her contribution, or so she thought. He always called her his secret weapon. Now she feared he was aiming that weapon at himself, and she was about to become collateral damage. The suspicion festered. A week later, she was organizing files in their home office when a sleek, unfamiliar envelope fell from a stack of Richard's papers. It was from a renowned jeweler, Cartier. Her heart pounded. Their anniversary wasn't for months, and her birthday had passed. With trembling hands, she opened it. It was a receipt. Engraved on the back of a Trinity bracelet were the initials CS and the words, "My Forever, R." The price tag was $28,000. The air left Eleanor's lungs. It wasn't the money. $28,000 was a rounding error to them. It was the intimacy of it. The inscription, My forever. He hadn't called her that in a decade. C.S. Chloe Summers. The name from the credit card statement. A quick soul-crushing search on social media revealed a woman half her age, a stunningly beautiful and ambitious junior analyst at a rival firm, Blackstone. Her profile was a curated fantasy of exotic travel, exclusive parties, and designer clothes, many of which Eleanor now realized had been funded by her husband. The gilded cage she had so lovingly decorated for 25 years suddenly felt cold, sharp, and suffocating. The tremor she had been feeling wasn't in the foundation. It was the entire structure preparing to collapse right on top of her. Eleanor spent 2 days in a state of suspended animation. She moved through her life like a ghost, the Cartier receipt a toxic secret burning in her purse. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It felt like a complete erasure of her existence. He was building a new life, a new forever, while she was still dutifully arranging lilies in their old one. She decided to confront him. Not with screams or tears, that wasn't her way. She would be calm, rational. She would give him a chance to explain, clinging to a foolish, desperate hope that this was all a monstrous misunderstanding. She waited until a Thursday evening. The children were away at their respective universities, Liam at Yale and Olivia at Stanford. The penthouse was quiet. She prepared a light dinner, something she hadn't done in years, and opened a bottle of the 1998 Chateau Margaux they had saved from their 10th anniversary. Richard arrived home late, humming to himself, radiating a smug energy she now found repulsive. "Smells good, Elle," he said, kissing the air near her cheek. "Tough day. Closed the deal on the Hudson Yards project. We're talking a $2 billion valuation." He poured himself a glass of wine, oblivious to the storm gathering in the room. "That's wonderful, Richard," Eleanor said, her voice steady. She sat down at the dining table, gesturing for him to join her. She let the silence stretch for a moment before she slid the Cartier receipt across the polished mahogany surface. He glanced down. For a fraction of a second, his confident mask slipped. A flicker of pure panic flashed in his eyes before being replaced by a cold, steely resolve. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. "Ah," he said, taking a sip of wine. "I suppose this was inevitable." The casualness of his admission was a physical blow. "Inevitable," she whispered the word, catching in her throat. "Richard, we've been married for 25 years. We have a family, a life. And it's been a good life," he said, his tone shifting from dismissive to condescending. He leaned forward, adopting the voice he used in boardrooms to dismantle his opponents. "But people change, Eleanor. I've changed. I want something different now. Something more vibrant. Vibrant." The word was a dagger. It meant younger, newer, not her. "Her name is Chloe," he continued, as if discussing a business merger. "She's bright, ambitious. She understands the world I live in now. The world we built." Eleanor corrected him, a spark of fire finally igniting within her. "The world you built on my back with my ideas and my support." Richard laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, let's not be dramatic. You've lived a very comfortable life. A life most women would kill for. And I intend to see that you continue to live comfortably." He then laid out his plan. It was a brutal, meticulously crafted strategy of dismissal. He had already spoken to his lawyer, the notoriously ruthless Marcus Thorne. He was offering her the penthouse, which he called a generous gift, a lump sum of $10 million, and an annual alimony of $500,000 for 5 years. "It's more than fair, Eleanor. It's generous. You'll be set for life. You can focus on your charities, your lunch dates, whatever it is you do. Whatever it is you do." The 4 words effectively deleted 25 years of partnership. He saw her as a hobbyist, a decorative accessory to his life of consequence. He truly believed he was being magnanimous, a benevolent king, pensioning off his consort. "And if I don't agree?" she asked, her voice trembling with a rage she hadn't felt in years. His smile vanished. "Then it gets ugly. Marcus will drag it out for years. We'll audit every dollar you've ever spent. We'll question your role in the company, your contributions. It will be public, it will be messy, and you will end up with far less. Don't fight me on this, L. It's a losing battle. The company, the assets, the real wealth, it's all mine. It's all in my name. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs, the picture of untouchable power. Marcus will have the papers drawn up by Monday. You just have to sign. He left the room without a backward glance, heading to the master bedroom to pack a bag. He was going to Chloe. He was starting his vibrant new life. Eleanor sat alone at the table, the untouched dinner growing cold. The wine in her glass seemed to mock her. He was right. How could she fight him? He was Richard Sterling. He held all the cards. The business entities, the offshore accounts, the labyrinthine network of corporations, it was all his domain. He had built the empire, and he would ensure she only left with the crumbs he was willing to sweep off the table. Tears finally came, hot and silent. It wasn't just the loss of her marriage. It was the profound humiliation. He had not only betrayed her, but had also appraised her worth and found it to be a mere $10 million plus alimony. She felt like a fool, a naive, trusting fool who had stood by her man only to have him turn around and declare that she was nothing without him. In that moment of absolute despair, a different feeling began to surface, deep and unfamiliar. It was a cold, hard ember of defiance. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten who she was before she became Mrs. Sterling. He had forgotten the brilliant, driven woman with the architect's mind, a mind that saw not just the beautiful facade, but the structural framework beneath. And he had made one other, far more critical mistake. A mistake made 20 years ago, born of his own paranoia that he had long since forgotten. But Eleanor was about to remember. The next morning, Eleanor woke up to an empty bed and a silence that was heavier than any sound. The shock had subsided, leaving behind the cold, clear certainty of a woman with nothing left to lose. Richard's words echoed in her mind. The company, the assets, the real wealth. It's all mine. It's all in my name. He was so sure of himself, so arrogant. But was he right? She called the one person she knew she could trust implicitly, Isabella Rossi. They had been roommates at Columbia, and while Eleanor had gone into real estate and marriage, Isabella had climbed the cutthroat ladder of corporate law, becoming a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore before she was 40. She was sharp, merciless, and fiercely loyal. "Izzy, it's me," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse. "I need your help." An hour later, Isabella was in the penthouse, sipping black coffee and listening with a stony expression as Eleanor recounted the entire sordid affair. When Eleanor finished, Isabella didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She got straight to business. "Marcus Thorne is a snake, but he's a predictable snake," Isabella said, her pen tapping a sharp rhythm on her notepad. "Richard's strategy is classic: intimidate, overwhelm, and force a quick settlement before you have time to fully assess the financials. He's counting on you being too emotional to think clearly." "He thinks I'm a fool," Eleanor said quietly. "Good," Isabella shot back. "Let him. We'll need every document you can find. Tax returns, bank statements, deeds, partnership agreements, anything and everything for the last 25 years, especially from the early days." For the next 2 days, Eleanor turned the home office upside down. She unearthed decades of financial history, creating piles of paper that documented their ascent from ambitious newcomers to titans of industry. On the third day, she tackled the one place she hadn't looked in years, the large fireproof safe hidden behind a false bookcase. It contained their personal documents, birth certificates, passports, and old wills. And at the very bottom, beneath dusty photo albums and her children's first drawings, was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She didn't recognize it at first. Wiping away a layer of dust, she read the embossed gold lettering, Vance Holdings, LLC. Vance. Her maiden name. Her breath caught. The memory came back in a sudden, overwhelming flood. It was 2005. Sterling Global was still a mid-sized player, but they were taking a huge risk on a massive redevelopment project in Soho. They were over-leveraged, and one of their primary lenders was threatening to pull out. At the same time, Richard was being threatened with a frivolous but potentially ruinous lawsuit from a disgruntled former partner. He had been terrified. Not of losing the business, but of creditors coming after their personal assets, their home, their savings, the nest egg they had carefully built. She remembered the night he came to her, his face pale with worry. "We need an iron wall, Elle," he had said. "A legal entity so separate from me and Sterling Global that no creditor, no court can ever touch it. A ghost in the machine." His own lawyers had advised against his plan, but Richard was adamant. He wanted to transfer their most valuable, non-liquid personal assets into a new holding company. The Soho property they were developing, their Hamptons estate, and a significant portfolio of blue-chip stocks. And to make it truly untouchable, the company could not be in his name. The ownership had to be 100% in hers. "It's just a temporary measure, darling," he had assured her, guiding her hand as she signed the reams of paperwork. "A bit of clever corporate structuring. Once this lawsuit is settled and the Soho project is stable, we'll dissolve it and put everything back in joint ownership." But the lawsuit was dismissed. The Soho project became a legendary success, catapulting them into the big leagues. The crisis passed. In the triumphant years that followed, with deals getting bigger and life getting busier, they simply forgot. The temporary ghost in the machine was never exorcised. Vance Holdings LLC, with Eleanor Vance as its sole member and owner, continued to exist, quietly holding the core of their personal fortune. With trembling fingers, she opened the portfolio. Inside were the original incorporation documents signed by her and notarized. There were the deeds to 3 of their most valuable properties, including the Hamptons beachfront mansion and a sprawling Napa Valley vineyard, all legally transferred to Vance Holdings. And there was the brokerage statement from J.P. Morgan for a securities portfolio. It had started with about $10 million in 2005. Over 2 decades of capital gains, dividends, and reinvestment, she did a quick, staggering calculation. The portfolio alone was now worth over $70 million. Adding the current market value of the real estate, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The penthouse was in Richard's name. The primary Sterling Global business accounts were his. But the bedrock of their personal wealth, the secure, untouchable assets they had built their empire upon, the fortune he was so certain was his to control. It was all in her name. Her maiden name. She stared at the documents, her heart hammering against her ribs. Richard, in his arrogant brilliance, had built her a fortress to protect her from his enemies. He had never once imagined that one day he would be the enemy on the outside trying to get in. He hadn't just handed her a shield, he had handed her the entire armory, and the war was just beginning. "Sweet Mother of God," Isabella whispered, staring at the documents spread across her mahogany conference room table. "Eleanor, this isn't a trump card. This is a royal flush." Isabella's legal mind was racing, connecting dots Eleanor hadn't even seen yet. He didn't just put the assets in the LLC. He used the LLC's capital as collateral for Sterling Global's expansion loans over the years. "We have bank records showing Vance Holdings guaranteeing millions in credit for his company. He's been treating your company like his personal piggy bank, and in doing so, he has legally affirmed its separate and critical existence time and time again." A plan began to form, not of immediate fiery confrontation, but of cold, strategic patience. "Here's what we do," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Nothing. You say nothing. You go back to him, you play the part of the distraught, defeated wife. You tell him you're considering his offer, but you need time. You need to talk to your accountant. Stall him. Let him get comfortable. Let him get arrogant." The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Richard's arrogance was his greatest weakness, and they would use it against him. While he was parading Chloe around town finalizing his new life, Eleanor and Isabella would be quietly fortifying their position. Playing the part was the hardest thing Eleanor had ever had to do. She met with Richard a week later in the penthouse library, a room where they had once dreamed up their future. She had cried real tears of remembered pain and told him she was overwhelmed. I need a moment to process this, Richard, she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. $10 million. It's a lot of money. I need to understand what my life will look like. Richard softened, a patronizing look on his face. He saw her tears as weakness, her hesitation as the fear of a woman who couldn't survive without him. It was exactly what he expected. Of course, Elle. Take a week, talk to an accountant. You'll see. It's a very, very generous offer, he said, patting her hand. He was so confident, so dismissive. While Richard was basking in his perceived victory, Eleanor was at Isabella's office executing their plan. Step 1 was to secure control. Isabella drafted a letter on Vance Holdings' letterhead to the Wealth Management Division at J.P. Morgan. It formally rescinded Richard's long-standing authority as a financial advisor on the account and explicitly stated that all future instructions would come solely from the owner, Eleanor Vance. They sent a similar notice to the property managers of the Hamptons and Napa estates. The first tremor from Richard's camp came 4 days later. Marcus Thorne called Isabella's office. His voice was casual, but Isabella could detect the underlying tension. Isabella, Marcus Thorne here, just a minor housekeeping issue. My client Richard Sterling was attempting to leverage a portion of the J.P. Morgan portfolio for a new acquisition and was told he's no longer authorized on the account. Must be some sort of clerical error. Can you have your client sign a form to rectify it? Isabella put the call on speakerphone so Eleanor could hear. No clerical error, Marcus, she replied coolly. My client is the sole owner of Vance Holdings. She's simply exercising her right to control her own assets. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Vance Holdings. Marcus repeated the name, sounding foreign. I'm not familiar. Is that the small LLC they set up for the Hamptons property? It's a bit more than that, Marcus, Isabella said, enjoying the moment. I suggest you look into it. Have a nice day. She hung up. Eleanor could picture the scene perfectly. Marcus Thorne confused, pulling old corporate files. The dawning realization. The frantic call to Richard. That evening, Richard came to the penthouse. The confident, condescending man was gone. In his place was a furious, cornered animal. What the hell did you do? He snarled, throwing his briefcase onto a chair. Vance Holdings. Are you insane? That was a legal technicality, a shell company. You know damn well that's my money. Eleanor stood her ground, a lifetime of placating him evaporating in the heat of her newfound resolve. Is it Richard? My name is on the ownership documents. My signature is on the bank mandates. My accountant seems to think it's my money. My lawyer agrees. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time in years, not as an accessory, but as an adversary. The look in his eyes was pure disbelief, as if his favorite hunting dog had suddenly turned and bitten his hand. This is a game, Eleanor, a stupid, vindictive game, and you are going to lose, he spat. I will bury you in litigation. I will prove in court that you had no role in earning that money, that it was a temporary asset protection scheme. The judge will laugh you out of the courtroom. Then let's go to court, she said, her voice as cold as ice. Let's put it all out there. Let's talk about the 25 years of my life, my work, my ideas. Let's talk about the company you built, using my assets as collateral. And while we're at it, let's talk about Chloe Summers. Let's talk about the corporate credit card and the gifts. I'm sure the press will love this story. Billionaire Titan's fortune actually belongs to the wife he cheated on. How do you think your investors will feel about that headline, Richard? The color drained from his face. She had hit a nerve. Public perception. Investor confidence. The two things he valued above all else. He had catastrophically underestimated her. He had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness, her loyalty for subservience. He saw the woman he thought he could discard for $10 million and realized she was holding the key to his entire kingdom. The quiet war was over. The checkmate was about to be called. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday in a sterile impersonal conference room at a neutral law firm in Midtown. The air was thick with tension. On one side of the vast, polished table sat Richard and a shell-shocked Marcus Thorne, flanked by two junior associates. Richard looked haggard, the confident swagger replaced by a rigid, barely contained fury. On the other side sat Eleanor, looking serene and powerful in a tailored Armani suit with Isabella Rossi by her side. Eleanor had spent the morning not in a panic, but at the Met, quietly observing the calm, timeless beauty of the Impressionist paintings. She had centered herself, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was in the right, not just legally, but morally. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, shuffling a ridiculously thin folder. "All right," he began, attempting a tone of weary reasonableness. "Clearly, there's been a misunderstanding. Richard is prepared to amend his initial offer in light of the complex nature of these legacy holdings." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a new offer. $25 million, the penthouse and the alimony remained. It was more than double the first offer, but it was still an insult. It was a desperate attempt to buy her off to make the problem go away. Isabella glanced at the paper without touching it. "Marcus, we're not here to negotiate Richard's pocket change," she said, her voice cutting through the pretense. "We are here to discuss the disposition of assets belonging to my client, Miss Eleanor Vance." Using Eleanor's maiden name was a deliberate tactical strike. It legally and symbolically separated her from the identity of Mrs. Sterling. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. That money is the product of my work, my risk." "It is my money." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards. "Was it your work when I found the Soho property, Richard? The one all your analysts told you to avoid? Was it your risk when I convinced the Vanderbilt estate to sell us the Hamptons land for a fraction of its worth, because I knew the family matriarch from my charity work?" She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "You're a brilliant deal-maker. I've never denied that. But you seem to have forgotten that every great structure needs a foundation. For 25 years I was your foundation, and 20 years ago you legally formalized that arrangement. You just forgot you did it." Isabella then placed a thick, beautifully bound portfolio on the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "This is the complete financial audit of Vance Holdings, LLC, she announced. "Current valuation of securities, real estate, and other holdings comes to approximately $106 million. She let that number sink in. Richard looked like he was going to be sick. "Furthermore," Isabella continued, "we have documented at least a dozen instances over the last 15 years where Vance Holdings assets were used as primary collateral for Sterling Global's credit lines. In essence, my client's personal wealth has been underwriting your corporate expansion. Should we be forced into litigation, we will not only be defending her ownership, but we will also be filing a counterclaim for years of unauthorized risk exposure and seeking significant damages." It was the final devastating blow. Richard hadn't just forgotten the money was in her name. He had actively used her assets to grow his business, creating a paper trail a mile long that proved her company was a vital, functioning part of his financial empire. He had unwittingly made her case for her. Marcus Thorne's face was pale. As a lawyer, he knew when the fight was over. He looked at Richard, a silent communication passing between them that said, "We are done. There is no way out of this." Richard stared across the table at Eleanor. The anger in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something else, a dawning, horrified respect. He was a man who understood power, and for the first time he saw the immense power of the woman he had so carelessly thrown away. He had played the game of his life and had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "So here is what is going to happen," she said, her voice devoid of malice, full of quiet, unshakable certainty. "Vance Holdings will remain my sole and separate property. We will sell the penthouse and divide the proceeds 50-50 as is fair. You will create educational trusts for Liam and Olivia to be funded by you personally. I will not ask for a single dollar of alimony. I don't need it." She stood up, the meeting clearly over. You wanted a new life, Richard. You're about to get one. I hope you enjoy it." She turned and walked out of the room, Isabella at her side, not looking back. It wasn't a victory march. It was a quiet declaration of independence. The checkmate wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming her name, her history, and her future. The king had been toppled from the board not by an invading army, but by the queen he had long forgotten was the most powerful piece in the game. The aftermath of the checkmate was swift and brutal for Richard. The news of the separation and the shocking financial reality behind it rippled through their social and business circles. The story Eleanor had predicted came to life, albeit in hushed tones at exclusive dinner parties and in cryptic notes within financial newsletters. The word was out, Richard Sterling wasn't as liquid as everyone thought. The bedrock of his personal fortune was gone. His first move was desperation. He tried emotional blackmail, calling Eleanor late at night, his voice alternating between rage and pathetic pleading. "You're destroying me, Elle," for what revenge he'd yell. "Think about our history. Think about the children." "I am thinking about the children, Richard," she replied calmly during one such call. "I'm thinking about the example I want to set for our daughter Olivia. I'm teaching her that a woman's worth is not determined by the man she stands beside." When emotional appeals failed, he turned to his new life only to find that it, too, was built on a foundation of sand. Chloe Summers had fallen for a billionaire titan, not a heavily leveraged real estate developer facing a credit crisis. Her vibrant ambition did not extend to standing by a man whose net worth had just been decimated. Their final fight reportedly took place in the lobby of the Baccarat Hotel. Chloe, realizing the promised river of gold had dried up, demanded to know why the plans for their new Tribeca loft and her summer in St. Bart's were suddenly on hold. When Richard admitted the truth about his financial situation, she didn't offer support. She laughed. "So let me get this straight," she said, her voice dripping with derision. "You let your ex-wife, the quiet little mouse you were so eager to get rid of, walk away with everything. You're not a titan. You're a fool." She left him standing there, his last illusion of a glorious new beginning shattering around him. Chloe Summers disappeared from his life as quickly as she had entered it, her social media soon featuring a new benefactor, an aging European baron. Professionally, Richard was spiraling. The news of his financial vulnerability made his lenders nervous. The credit lines that Vance Holdings had once guaranteed were called in for review. Without that $100 million safety net, Sterling Global's risk profile looked dangerously high. He was forced to halt 2 major development projects and sell off a prime piece of commercial real estate at a loss just to cover his debts. He wasn't bankrupt, he was still a wealthy man by any normal standard, but the Sterling empire was humbled, its invincible aura gone forever. He was just another struggling developer in a city full of them. His relationship with his children fractured. Liam, his son from Yale, called him, his voice filled with a disappointment that was worse than anger. "I always looked up to you, Dad. I thought you were invincible. But what you did to Mom, it wasn't just wrong, it was stupid. You underestimated her. You underestimated our whole family." Eleanor, meanwhile, handled her newfound power with grace and precision. She sold the Napa Vineyard and the Hamptons estate not out of spite, but as a practical matter to diversify her assets. She moved out of the penthouse and into a beautiful light-filled brownstone in the West Village that was all her own. It was elegant but understated, a reflection of her true self, not the grandiose statement of the life she had lived with Richard. She established ironclad trusts for Liam and Olivia, ensuring their futures were secure regardless of their father's financial roller coaster. She then made her boldest move. She took $20 million of her fortune and established the Vance Foundation, its mission dedicated to providing scholarships and grants for women in architecture and business, a tribute to the dreams she had put on hold so many years ago. It was a statement that her money would be used not for vanity, but for purpose. She saw Richard one last time to sign the final divorce papers. He looked older, smaller, diminished by his failures. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. "You won, Eleanor," he said quietly, not looking at her. "I hope you're happy." Eleanor looked at the man she had once loved, the father of her children, and felt not triumph, but a quiet, sad resolution. "This was never about winning Richard," she said softly. "It was about not losing myself." 1 year later, the name Eleanor Vance was being spoken in circles where Eleanor Sterling had only ever been a silent partner. She had become a force in her own right. The Vance Foundation was a celebrated success, having already sponsored 24 brilliant young women through graduate programs. Eleanor wasn't just a figurehead. She was actively involved, mentoring students, reviewing proposals, and using the sharp business acumen she had honed over a lifetime. She had reconnected with her passion for architecture, not by building skyscrapers, but by investing in historical preservation projects, saving beautiful old buildings from the wrecking ball, a poignant metaphor for her own life. She traveled not to the glitzy see-and-be-seen resorts Richard had favored, but to places that fed her soul, the quiet museums of Florence, the rugged coast of Ireland, the vibrant markets of Kyoto. Her children, Liam and Olivia, had become her true partners. They respected her immensely, not just for her financial victory, but for the quiet strength and integrity she had shown. They spent holidays with her in the West Village brownstone, a home filled with laughter and easy conversation, a warmth the sterile penthouse had never possessed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor was in her home office reviewing a proposal for a new scholarship fund. The sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Olivia. "Hey, Mom. Saw this and thought of you. You're officially a legend." Below was a link to a Forbes article titled, "The New Philanthropists: How Eleanor Vance is Reshaping Female Empowerment in Business." It was a glowing profile detailing her journey and the impactful work of her foundation. It mentioned her past life in a single tactful sentence, referring to her simply as a former real estate visionary who has now stepped into the spotlight on her own terms. There was no mention of Richard Sterling's name. He had become a footnote in her story. A small smile played on Eleanor's lips. She looked around her office at the architectural drawings pinned to the wall, at the photos of her smiling children, at the view of the beautiful, tree-lined street outside. She was not the woman she had been. The gilded cage had been unlocked, its bars melted down and reforged into something new, something strong, something entirely her own. She hadn't just taken the money, she had taken back her life. She had risen from the ashes of a painful betrayal, not as a vengeful fury, but as a phoenix, stronger and more brilliant than before, flying freely under a sky that was, for the first time in a very long time, completely her own. 2 years after the divorce, the name Sterling had been cleaved in two. Eleanor's half, or rather the Vance name she had resurrected, was synonymous with integrity and a new wave of focused philanthropy. The Vance Foundation was no longer a fledgling project, but a respected institution, a kingmaker for a new generation of female leaders. Eleanor moved with an ease and confidence that seemed to radiate from her very core. She had found that the greatest luxury wasn't a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, but a life lived on her own terms. Richard's half of the name, however, had become a cautionary tale, whispered in the boardrooms and country clubs he once dominated. Sterling Global Properties, stripped of its cash-rich foundation and crippled by debt, had been in a slow, agonizing death spiral. He had sold off trophy assets, laid off hundreds of employees, and shrunk his operations to a skeleton of their former glory. He was no longer a titan. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had moved on without him. Eleanor rarely thought of him. Her life was full, her schedule packed with foundation meetings, Preservation Society galas, and treasured weekends with Liam and Olivia. But the past has a way of leaving unpaid debts, and one Tuesday afternoon, a debt she never knew existed came calling. The call wasn't from Richard. It was from a woman named Maria Sanchez. Maria had been Richard's executive assistant for over 30 years, a quiet, fiercely competent woman who had been a constant calming presence since the company's earliest days. Eleanor had always liked her. Mrs. Sterling. Ms. Vance. Maria began, her voice strained. "I am so sorry to bother you. I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't..." Desperate. Maria, it's no bother at all. What is it? Are you all right? Eleanor asked, a knot of concern tightening in her stomach. I'm fine, but it's about the company. The end is coming, Ms. Vance. The banks are closing in. They're initiating Chapter 7 liquidation, not even Chapter 11 reorganization. They're going to sell it for parts. There was a pause, and Eleanor heard Maria take a shaky breath. It's about the pension fund, for the long-term staff, the construction foremen, the office managers, the people who have been here since the beginning. It was underfunded for years, and with the liquidation, it's going to be wiped out. These are people in their 60s and 70s, Eleanor. They gave their lives to this company. They're going to be left with nothing. Eleanor felt a cold dread creep over her. These weren't faceless employees. She knew them. She remembered Frank, the head carpenter who had built the custom bookshelves in Liam's childhood bedroom. She remembered Susan from accounting, who always brought in homemade cookies for the holidays. Where is Richard in all of this? Eleanor asked, her voice tight. He's fought until he has nothing left to fight with, Maria said, her voice breaking with a mix of pity and loyalty. He has sold everything he personally owns to try and make payroll. He lives in a small rented apartment in Westchester now. He has nothing left to give. He wanted me to ask. He is too ashamed to ask himself. If you would meet with him. Not for him. For them. Eleanor's first instinct, a primal protective urge, was to say no. Why should she clean up his mess? Why should her hard-won peace be disturbed by the wreckage he had caused? She had a duty to her foundation, to her children, to herself. Her business with Richard Sterling was finished. But then she thought of Frank's calloused hands and Susan's kind smile. Her war had been with Richard, not with them. They were the silent, innocent casualties of his arrogance and her victory. Tell him I'll meet him, she said, her decision solidifying even as she spoke the words. Tomorrow, noon, the cafe at the Neue Galerie. It was neutral ground, a place of quiet, civilized art, far removed from the battlefields of their past life. The man who sat waiting for her at a small table looked like a faded photograph of Richard Sterling. He was thin, his expensive suit hung on him loosely, and the charismatic energy that had once filled every room he entered was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. His hair was almost completely white. He stood awkwardly as she approached. Eleanor, thank you for coming. Richard, she said, her tone polite but distant. She didn't sit down. Maria explained the situation. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. He stared into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to all his failures. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, he began, his voice raspy. What I did to you, to us, was unforgivable. I was a fool, blinded by my own ego. I see that now. I see it every single day in the ruins of everything I built. He finally looked up, and for the first time Eleanor saw not a monster or a rival, but simply a broken man. This isn't about me, he said. I'll survive, or I won't. It doesn't matter. But these people, Frank, Susan, 100 others, they trusted me. They built that company with me. When we started, you and I, we promised them we would take care of them. It was one of the first things we agreed on. A company is its people. Eleanor remembered that conversation 25 years ago in their small first apartment, dreaming of the kind of company they would build. A company with integrity. The pension fund is short by about $8 million, he said, the number falling like a stone in the quiet cafe. The banks won't touch it. It's an unsecured liability. It will simply vanish. I'm not asking for a loan. I am not asking for a handout. I am asking you to find a way to help them. For the good woman you always were, not because of the man I failed to be. He had laid himself completely bare. All the arrogance and bluster had been burned away, leaving only this raw, desperate plea. He had finally done something truly selfless. He was using his last final connection, his history with her, not to save himself, but to save others. Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment, She saw the entire arc of their lives flash before her eyes, the ambitious young couple, the unstoppable titans, the bitter enemies, and now this, the victor and the vanquished bound by a shared history and a forgotten promise. "I will look into it," she said finally. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "My people will be in touch." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his coffee. That evening she had a fierce debate with Isabella. "Absolutely not," Isabella argued, pacing in Eleanor's study. "It's a black hole, Eleanor. You'd be throwing good money after bad. Let him fail. It's the consequence of his actions. Your only duty is to yourself and the foundation." "Is it, Izzy?" Eleanor countered, looking out at the city lights. "The foundation's mission is to empower people to give them a secure future. How can I do that for strangers if I turn my back on the people who helped build the very fortune that allows me to do this work? This isn't for him. He will never see a dime of it. This is about who I am now. Am I a woman defined by a grudge or by my principles?" Her decision was made. She didn't just write a check. That would have been too easy, too transactional. Instead, she tasked the sharpest legal and financial minds working for the Vance Foundation to create a solution. They formed a new independent trust completely separate from Sterling Global and Richard Sterling. The Vance Foundation made a one-time $8 million grant to establish the Sterling Properties Legacy Pension Trust. It was a masterstroke of strategy and compassion. The name honored the loyal employees while the structure completely insulated her and the foundation from any further liability. She communicated the plan through Isabella's office. Richard was to have no part in its administration. The trust would be managed by an independent third party, ensuring every dollar went to the retirees. A week later, a simple hand-delivered envelope arrived at her brownstone. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in Richard's now unfamiliar scrawl. "Thank you, Eleanor. You were always the better half of me." She read the note and for the first time felt the last vestiges of bitterness and anger dissolve. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was acceptance. It was closure. By saving his legacy, she had finally completely transcended it. She placed the note in a drawer, a final artifact from a life that no longer belonged to her, and turned back to the work and the future that did. And so Eleanor's story isn't just about a $100 million fortune. It's a story about value. Richard Sterling saw Eleanor's value as $10 million and a penthouse. He was wrong. Her true value was in her intellect, her resilience, and a quiet strength he never bothered to look for. In his arrogance, he signed a piece of paper 20 years ago, thinking he was protecting his assets, but in reality, he was writing the first chapter of his own downfall and her spectacular rise. It's a powerful reminder that the biggest risks we take are the people we choose to underestimate. What did you think of Eleanor's incredible checkmate? Have you ever seen such a satisfying story of someone turning the tables on a person who wronged them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a great tale of justice, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true life dramas. Thank you for listening. What happens when your fairy tale life turns into your worst nightmare overnight? For Amelia Hayes, she had it all: a sprawling home in the Hollywood Hills, a loving marriage to billionaire tech mogul Richard Sterling, and their first child on the way. She was living a dream. But one rainy Tuesday, that dream was shattered by a fatal car crash. And as Amelia was drowning in grief, she was about to be drowned by the ultimate betrayal. At the reading of her husband's will, she discovered his entire $500 million fortune wasn't left to her or their unborn child, but to a woman she had never even heard of. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story of a pregnant, widowed wife who, with nothing left to lose, decided to fight back against a ghost, a mistress and a legal system designed to crush her. Stay with us, as we uncover the shocking twists and turns of a battle that proves hell hath no fury like a woman scorned and a mother protecting her child. The silence was the worst part. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that had fallen over the 10,000-square-foot Beverly Hills estate. Just 3 days ago, this house had been filled with the resonant baritone of her husband Richard Sterling, as he debated stock prices on the phone, the clinking of ice in his evening whiskey, and the soft, hopeful plans they'd make for the nursery in the East Wing. Now the silence was broken only by Amelia Hayes's own ragged breaths and the sympathetic yet useless ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Richard was gone. A rain-slicked stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway, a misjudged corner and a head-on collision had erased the brilliant, charismatic, and infuriating man she loved from the world. At 34, Amelia was a widow. At 7 months pregnant, she was about to be a single mother. Her hand rested instinctively on the swell of her belly, a gesture that had become her only anchor in a world thrown off its axis. Their son. They'd been so excited. Richard, who had conquered the tech world with his company Nexus Dynamics, had been childlike in his glee, already buying miniature bespoke suits and tiny driving shoes. "He's a Sterling," he'd boom. "He needs to look the part." Amelia had laughed her own background as a successful architect, feeling quaint next to his larger-than-life persona. They had met at a charity gala 5 years ago. She was there overseeing the event design. He was the keynote speaker. He had pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a hostile takeover, and she, despite her initial reservations about his flashy lifestyle, had fallen for the sharp mind and surprisingly tender heart beneath the billionaire armor. The first few days after the crash were a blur of condolences, casseroles from neighbors she barely knew, and the hollow-eyed pity of friends. Her sister Chloe had flown in from Chicago and moved into a guest room, becoming a silent, efficient sentinel who managed phone calls and ensured Amelia remembered to eat. The call for the reading of the will came a week after the funeral. It felt brutally fast, a cold administrative necessity trampling on the sacred ground of her grief. Richard's longtime lawyer, a stoic man named Arthur Vance, had requested her presence at his downtown LA office. "Is this really necessary right now?" "Arthur," Amelia had asked, her voice raspy. "It is, Amelia. Richard's estate is complex. There are business provisions in the will that must be addressed immediately to ensure the stability of Nexus Dynamics. I'm very sorry." So she went. Dressed in a simple black maternity dress that felt like a costume, she sat in a leather chair that smelled of old books and money. Arthur's office was on the 40th floor, with a panoramic view of a city that now felt alien and hostile. David Chen, Richard's business partner and best friend, was also there, his face pale and drawn. He gave her a weak, apologetic smile. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the document. The legalese washed over Amelia Trust's stock options holding companies. She expected the bulk of it to be a formality. Richard had always been clear, "Everything I have is for you and for him," he'd say, patting her stomach. Their future and their son's future was secure. That was the one cold comfort in this whole tragedy. Arthur read through clauses about a few charitable donations and a generous provision for his aging mother. Then he paused, took a sip of water, and looked at Amelia over the rim of his glasses. His expression was one she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to dread. And now Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, "We come to the residuary estate. This clause, dated 6 months ago, supersedes all previous versions." He took a deep breath. "I, Richard Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my remaining personal and professional assets, including all properties, liquid capital, and my controlling shares in Nexus Dynamics, to Ms. Isabella Rossi." The name hung in the air, a foreign object with no meaning. Isabella Rossi. Amelia looked at Arthur, expecting a correction. A typo. A joke in the worst possible taste. "I'm sorry." Amelia said, a faint, nervous laugh escaping her lips. Who? David Chen flinched beside her, looking down at his clasped hands as if they held the secrets of the universe. That was the first alarm bell. David knew the name. Arthur Vance's face was grim. Isabella Rossi, he repeated as if speaking to a child. He pushed a smaller document across the polished mahogany desk. It was a single sheet of paper with a name and address in Soho, New York, and a social security number. Amelia's mind was a frantic buzzing blank. She searched her memory for any mention of this woman. A business associate? A distant cousin? Nothing. The name was a void. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. There must be a mistake. Our son? What about our son Richard would never... Arthur's gaze softened, but his words were like shards of glass. Amelia, the will is legally ironclad. It was signed, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized. Richard was declared to be of sound mind. According to this document, his entire fortune, estimated at over $500 million, belongs to Ms. Rossi. The room began to spin. The panoramic view of the city tilted violently. $500 million. Everything. The house she was living in. The money for her baby's future. The company Richard had built from nothing. All of it was gone, handed to a stranger. A cold, creeping dread far worse than grief began to seep into her bones. Grief was the pain of loss. This was the horror of erasure. It was as if her entire 5-year marriage, the life they had built, the child she was carrying, had been wiped away by a signature on a piece of paper. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her eyes locked on David Chen. David, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Who is she? David couldn't meet her gaze. He just shook his head, his silence a deafening confession. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Richard hadn't just died. He had systematically, secretly, and deliberately disinherited her and their unborn child. And his best friend had known. The silence that had haunted her home for a week suddenly had a name. It was the sound of a secret life, a life that had just detonated her own. The storm of grief was over. The war was just beginning. The drive back to Beverly Hills was a silent movie of Amelia's life crumbling. The sun-drenched palms and designer storefronts of Rodeo Drive seemed to mock her, artifacts from a life that was no longer hers. Chloe was waiting on the marble steps of the house, Isabella Rossi's house. A cruel voice in her head corrected, and knew from one look at Amelia's face that something was terribly wrong. Inside the story tumbled out a torrent of disbelief and pain. Chloe listened, her expression hardening from sympathy to outrage. A mistake. It has to be a mistake, Chloe insisted, pacing the vast living room. Blackmail, coercion. There's no way Richard would do this. But Amelia had seen David Chen's face. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was no mistake. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated demolition of their life together. That night's sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind, an architect's mind trained to see blueprints and structures, was now obsessed with deconstructing her husband's secret life. Armed with a glass of milk and Richard's laptop, which his assistant had dropped off, she began to dig. His password was, with a sickening irony, their anniversary. 0514. For a moment she felt a flicker of hope. A man who used their anniversary as a password couldn't be a monster. The hope died a quick and brutal death. There was nothing obvious in his primary email account. It was all business, Nexus Dynamics board meetings, and a few emails to her with flight confirmations for their baby moon to Italy, a trip they would never take. But Richard was a creature of habit and redundancy. He had backups for his backups. Amelia found a link to a cloud storage account buried in a subfolder labeled Personal Ventures. The password for this was different. She tried his birthday, his mother's birthday, the company's founding date. Nothing. On a whim, her fingers typed Isabella. Access granted. The contents of the folder were a digital stab to the heart. It wasn't just an affair. It was a parallel life. There were hundreds of photos. Richard and a stunningly beautiful woman with raven black hair and piercing green eyes. They were in Paris, laughing under the Eiffel Tower. On a yacht in Monaco, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. In a cozy New York apartment decorated with expensive modern art, looking every bit the established couple. This was Isabella Rossi. The dates on the photos stretched back 3 years. 3 years of lies. He had been with this woman a year before he'd even proposed to Amelia. He had proposed to her, looked her in the eyes, and promised her forever, all while living this other life. Then she found the financial records. A folder simply labeled IR contained a litany of devastation. A wire transfer for $2.5 million, the down payment for an art gallery in Soho. Monthly credit card statements for a card Amelia never knew existed, with charges from Cartier, Chanel, and five-star hotels around the world. He hadn't just been having an affair, he had been funding an entire existence for this woman. The final document was a PDF scan, a preliminary draft of the will she'd heard read just hours ago. The date on it was from 8 months back, just a week after Amelia had tearfully told him she was pregnant. The timing was a calculated cruelty that made her physically ill. He had learned he was going to be a father, and in response, he had written his son out of his life. The next morning, Amelia wasn't just grieving. She was cold with a fury so profound it felt like a new source of energy. Grief made you weak. Rage made you focused. She called David Chin. "We need to talk," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "My house. 1 hour." He arrived looking like he hadn't slept. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, refusing to sit. "Why, David?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" He finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and pity. "I didn't know the extent of it, Amelia. I swear. I knew about Isabella. Richard called her his escape. He said things with you were perfect, almost too perfect. He felt he couldn't be his real messy self. He said Isabella. She understood his demons. His demons." Amelia's voice dripped with scorn. "His demons drove a Porsche and shopped on Fifth Avenue." "He was going to tell you," David stammered. "After the baby was born, he was torn. He loved you, Amelia. He really did. But he was addicted to her, to the life he had with her. The will. I had no idea about the will. That's a shock to me, too. It's insane. It's not the Richard I knew. The Richard you knew was a liar," she stated flatly. "And you enabled him." She dismissed him with a wave of her hand, the friendship they had shared now just another piece of wreckage. Her path was clear. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about the fact that Richard's son would not be born into a world where his own father had declared him worthless. She remembered the lawyer who had handled her prenuptial agreement with Richard, a savvy, no-nonsense woman who had warned her in a gentle but firm way about the power imbalances in the relationship. A woman Richard had dismissed as an overly aggressive shark. That was exactly the kind of shark Amelia needed now. She found the card in her old file cabinet. Eleanor Vance and Associates, specializing in high-stakes family law and estate litigation. Arthur Vance's daughter. The irony was not lost on her. When she called, she got Eleanor's assistant. "Ms. Vance is booked for the next 3 months. Tell her it's Amelia Hayes." The widow of Richard Sterling. Amelia said, a new hardness in her tone. "Tell her I'm about to be evicted from my home by a ghost, and I'm 7 months pregnant with a disinherited baby. I'm quite sure she'll find the time." Eleanor Vance called back in 10 minutes. The meeting was set for the next day. As Amelia hung up the phone, she walked over to the grand window overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens. The gardeners were still tending to the roses Richard had planted for her. Soon they would be taking orders from Isabella Rossi. Amelia placed a hand on her belly. "He won't erase you," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I won't let him." Eleanor Vance's office was the antithesis of her father's. Where Arthur's was old-world wood-paneled and masculine, Eleanor's was stark modern and radiating sharp feminine power. Glass walls, chrome furniture, and a single dramatic orchid on a white desk. Eleanor herself was in her early 40s with a severe blonde bob and eyes that seemed to analyze, categorize, and dismiss you all in the space of a single handshake. Amelia laid out the story, pushing the printouts from Richard's secret cloud account across the desk. The photos, the bank statements, the draft of the will. She spoke with a detached clinical precision, having walled off her emotions for the sake of clarity. Eleanor listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. When Amelia was finished, she was silent for a full minute. "Your husband was a very methodical man," Eleanor said finally, her voice crisp. "And a very thorough bastard. Forgive my French." "Can I fight this?" Amelia asked, the question hanging in the air. "You can always fight," Eleanor corrected. "The question is, can you win? On the surface, the will is sound. He was of age, he signed it, it was witnessed. His mental state would be the primary angle of attack. We would have to prove one of two things. Either he lacked testamentary capacity, meaning he was not of sound mind when he signed it, or he was under undue influence. He wasn't insane, Eleanor. He was running a multi-billion-dollar company." "I'm not talking about insanity," Eleanor clarified, leaning forward. "I'm talking about a state of mind so compromised that he was not acting of his own free will." "Was he ill?" "On any heavy medication." "Showing signs of cognitive decline?" Amelia thought back. In the last year, Richard had been more volatile, more secretive. He'd had bouts of intense paranoia about corporate espionage and had been drinking more heavily, but enough to invalidate a will. It seemed like a stretch. "That leaves undue influence," Eleanor continued. "We have to prove that this Isabella Rossi exerted a level of psychological control over him that essentially subverted his own intentions and replaced them with hers. We have to paint her as a predator, a manipulator who isolated him and coerced him into this decision. She's the one he left his entire fortune to, abandoning his pregnant wife. Doesn't that speak for itself?" Amelia asked, a note of frustration in her voice. "To you, yes. To a judge, it's just a man changing his mind. Rich, powerful men have mistresses. It's a tale as old as time. The courts are unsympathetic unless we can prove malicious predatory intent." A letter arrived 2 days later. It was from a prestigious law firm, Thorne & Associates, representing the executor of the estate of Richard Sterling and its sole beneficiary, Ms. Isabella Rossi. It was a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. Tucked inside was a second envelope. This one was personal, handwritten on thick, cream-colored cardstock. "Dear Amelia," the note began, the handwriting an elegant looping script. "I cannot begin to imagine the pain you are feeling right now. I know this must be a terrible shock. Richard spoke of you with great respect, and he never intended to cause you hurt. What he and I shared was something separate, something he felt he needed. He was a complex man, and he made this decision for reasons I hope you can one day understand. To that end, my lawyers have drafted a settlement offer. It is my hope that this will provide for you and the child and allow us all to move on without a painful and public conflict. I wish you nothing but the best. Sincerely, Isabella Rossi." The attached settlement offered a one-time payment of $5 million. In exchange, Amelia would waive all future claims to the estate and agree to a non-disclosure agreement. $5 million, Amelia spat, tossing the letter onto Eleanor's desk. "It's a rounding error for an estate this size. It's an insult." "It's not an insult, Amelia." "It's a strategic move," Eleanor countered, picking up the letter. "It's a very smart one, actually. It paints her as reasonable, even generous. If we refuse and go to court, her lawyers will use this. They'll say, 'We tried to provide for the grieving widow, Your Honor, but she was greedy. She wanted it all.' This is her first move in the chess game. So what's our move? We file an immediate challenge to the will. We file for an injunction to stop the eviction and freeze the estate's assets." And Eleanor paused, her eyes gleaming. "We arrange a meeting. I want to see this woman. I want to look her in the eye and see who we are dealing with." The meeting took place a week later in a neutral location, a private conference room at a luxury hotel. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked in. Eleanor was a calming presence beside her, radiating an icy confidence. Isabella Rossi was already seated. She was even more beautiful in person than in the photographs. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored navy blue dress with her dark hair pulled back in a chic chignon, she looked less like a homewrecker and more like a CEO. Beside her sat her lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, who had the predatory smile of a shark. Isabella stood as they entered, her expression one of deep, practiced sorrow. "Amelia," she said, her voice soft and cultured. "Thank you for coming. I am so terribly sorry for your loss. For our loss." The "our" was a deliberate, calculated jab. Amelia felt a hot flash of rage but kept her expression neutral, just as Eleanor had coached her. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," Eleanor said, taking a seat. "My client has received your offer. We are rejecting it." Marcus Thorne chuckled. "Ms. Vance, with all due respect, on what grounds you have a legally binding will and testament? Your client has a prenuptial agreement that, while generous, doesn't entitle her to the primary estate. Your case is based on emotion, not law. My case is based on the fact that Mr. Sterling, a man who was famously devoted to building a legacy, inexplicably disinherited his only son and heir. Just weeks after learning of his existence," Eleanor shot back. "We find that highly suspect. We find it indicative of undue influence." Isabella finally spoke, her gaze fixed on Amelia. Her green eyes were filled with what looked like genuine empathy, a performance so convincing it was terrifying. "This wasn't about money, Amelia." Richard felt trapped. He felt he was playing a role with you, the perfect husband, the perfect father-to-be. With me, he could just be himself. He left me his fortune because he knew I understood his true legacy, his soul. It was a testament to our connection, not an attack on you. Every word was a perfectly crafted insult, painting Amelia as a naive placeholder in Richard's real life. "His soul," Amelia said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "You knew he had a wife. You knew he had a child on the way. And you took everything. You call that understanding his soul, I call it a heist." Isabella's mask of sympathy flickered for a brief second. A flicker of something cold and hard flashed in her eyes before she replaced it with a wounded look. "I'm sorry you see it that way," she murmured. "We were trying to handle this with dignity." "Dignity," Marcus Thorne interjected, closing his briefcase with a sharp snap, "is accepting the generous offer on the table. The alternative is a very public, very ugly court battle where your and Mr. Sterling's private lives will be dissected in excruciating detail. I have to ask you, Ms. Hayes, is that something you want to put yourself and your unborn child through? I suggest you reconsider." It was a threat cloaked in legal concern. They were banking on her being too pregnant, too grieving, and too intimidated to fight. They were counting on her to take the money and disappear. As they walked out of the hotel, Amelia felt a tremor of fear. Thorne was right. A court battle would be brutal. They would try to tear her apart on the stand. "She's good," Eleanor said, her voice grim as they waited for the valet. "She's playing the part of the tragic soulmate perfectly. Thorne is a viper. They think they have this one." "Do they?" Amelia asked, her voice small. Eleanor looked at her, a fierce light in her eyes. "They have a signed document. We have a story of a predatory mistress and a compromised man. Right now it's a coin toss. Our job is to find the evidence that proves our story is the true one. We need to dig into Isabella Rossi's life. We need to find out who she really was before she became Richard's soulmate. Because women like that, they almost always have a past." The battle for the estate began not in a courtroom, but in the shadowy world of private investigation. While Eleanor's legal team filed motions and injunctions buying Amelia precious time in her home, a man named Frank Miller was tasked with excavating Isabella Rossi's life. Frank was a former NYPD detective with a bloodhound's nose for secrets and a demeanor that could coax stories out of stones. his first reports were frustratingly thin. Isabella Rossi, 38, had no criminal record. She'd immigrated from Italy with her family as a child. She had a degree in art history from Columbia University. For years, she worked at various high-end galleries in Manhattan before opening her own Galleria Rossi in Soho, the one Richard had funded. On paper, she was the embodiment of the American dream, a smart, cultured, self-made woman. "She's clean, Eleanor," Frank reported a week into the investigation. Her financials were a little shaky before she met Sterling, some credit card debt and a business loan she was struggling with, but nothing that screams master criminal. "She's just lucky, I guess." "No one's that lucky, Frank," Eleanor insisted. "Keep digging. Talk to people. Ex-boyfriends, former colleagues, estranged family. Someone knows something." Meanwhile, Amelia was engaged in her own form of archaeology, sifting through the remnants of her marriage. She went through Richard's old journals, his photo albums, his correspondence, looking for any sign of the man who could do this. She found notes about his insecurities, his fear of not living up to his own father's legacy, a profound loneliness that success seemed to amplify rather than cure. It was the messy self David Chen had talked about. Isabella hadn't created these vulnerabilities. She had found them and exploited them. The first crack in Isabella's pristine facade came from an unexpected source. Frank tracked down a disgruntled former curator from Galleria Rossi, a woman named Clara who had been fired 6 months prior. Clara was initially hesitant to talk, bound by an NDA, but Frank's particular brand of persuasive charm and the implication that her silence could be seen as complicity in a major fraud case loosened her tongue. "Isabella is a chameleon," Clara said, nursing a coffee in a dingy Brooklyn diner. "She becomes whatever the person across from her wants her to be, especially if that person is a man with a 9-figure net worth. Richard Sterling wasn't her first." The air in the diner suddenly felt charged. "What do you mean?" Frank pressed. "About 5 years before she met Richard, there was another one, a real estate tycoon named Julian Croft. Older, recently divorced, incredibly wealthy. She met him at a Christie's auction. Within 6 months she was living in his Park Avenue penthouse. He doted on her, bought her art, introduced her to everyone. She was his entire world." "What happened to him?" Frank asked. Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He died. A heart attack, they said. He was in his late 60s, so no one looked twice. But it was sudden. He'd just had a full physical and been given a clean bill of health. And the timing was convenient." Frank's pulse quickened. "Convenient how?" "He'd just added her to his will. Not for everything like with Sterling, but for a modest sum, $10 million. Enough for her to leave the gallery she was at and start planning for her own. But the money got tied up in a fight with his kids. By the time she got it, most of it was gone to legal fees. She learned a lesson from that, I think. She learned to aim for the whole damn thing and make it ironclad. This was it, a pattern of behavior. It was the leverage they needed to argue that Isabella wasn't a passive lover, but an active predator with a history." Frank spent the next week digging into the life and death of Julian Croft. The official cause of death was a massive coronary thrombosis. There was no autopsy performed as his family doctor signed the death certificate. It was a dead end, but a tantalizing one. It might not be admissible in court, but it told them exactly who Isabella was. Back in Los Angeles, Amelia received an unwelcome visitor. Margaret Sterling, Richard's mother, appeared at her doorstep unannounced. Margaret was a formidable woman, an old money matriarch, who had always treated Amelia with a polite but cool distance. She believed Amelia was a perfectly suitable wife, but not the society-bred woman she had envisioned for her brilliant son. "Amelia," she said, her tone brisk as she stepped into the foyer, "we need to talk about this circus you are creating." She sat in the formal living room, refusing any offer of tea or water. "I have read the letters from Richard's lawyers. I have read about your lawsuit. You are dragging the Sterling name through the mud. Richard made his wishes clear. For you to contest them is unseemly. Amelia, her belly now a prominent curve under her sweater, felt a surge of defiance. Unseemly. Your son disinherited his own child, Margaret. He left everything he had to a woman he was having an affair with for 3 years, and you are worried about appearances. Richard was a complicated man, Margaret said, her voice unwavering. He clearly felt a profound connection with this woman. Perhaps she understood him in a way you did not. He made a choice. Your choice now is to accept it with grace, or to create a public spectacle that will only tarnish his memory and hurt your child in the long run. The conversation was a brutal reminder of the world they were up against. A world where a man's last wishes, no matter how cruel, were seen as sacrosanct, and the woman left behind was expected to grieve quietly and accept her fate. Margaret saw Isabella not as a threat, but as the fulfillment of a romantic if tragic narrative. I am not tarnishing his memory, Amelia said, her voice low and steady. I am protecting his son. The son you are apparently willing to see cast aside. This is my house, Margaret. If you've come here to tell me to give up, you can leave. The encounter left Amelia shaken but also strangely resolved. The battle lines were clearer than ever. On one side was money, power, and a carefully constructed narrative. On her side was the simple, undeniable truth of a mother's instinct. A few days later, Eleanor called with news. Frank found something. It's not the smoking gun, but it's a very interesting bullet. Remember Clara, the ex-curator? She kept some things from her time at the gallery. Voicemails she saved to protect herself after Isabella fired her. And Amelia pressed, her heart pounding. There's one in particular. It's a message Isabella left for a friend in Italy right after Julian Croft died. She's upset, but not because she's grieving. She's furious that his kids are challenging the will. Listen to this line. Frank transcribed it for me. He promised me security, the old fool. I played my part perfectly for 2 years, and his greedy children want to steal it away. I won't make that mistake again. Next time I'll make sure it's all locked down before the idiot even gets a cold. Amelia sank into a chair, the words echoing in the silent room. I won't make that mistake again. Richard hadn't just been a lover. He had been her second chance, her do-over, her masterpiece of manipulation. Is it enough? Amelia whispered. It's enough to get us in the ring. Eleanor's voice was grimly determined. It proves intent. It proves a pattern. Now we just have to convince a judge that Richard Sterling wasn't a man in love. He was the next idiot in her collection. The Superior Court of California County of Los Angeles was an imposing building, a modern temple of justice where lives were dismantled and rebuilt daily. As Amelia walked up the steps, 7.5 months pregnant, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. The story had been leaked to the press, and the media had descended like vultures. "Billionaire's secret will," screamed one headline. "Pregnant widow versus the other woman," read another. They had turned her tragedy into a salacious soap opera. Inside courtroom 14B was packed. On one side, Amelia sat with Eleanor, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed forward. On the other, Isabella and Marcus Thorne were a picture of cool confidence. Isabella was dressed in a conservative charcoal suit, her expression one of pained reluctance, as if this whole affair was a distasteful duty she was forced to endure. The trial began with opening statements. Marcus Thorne went first. He was a master orator, his voice resonating through the courtroom. He painted a picture of Richard Sterling as a tortured genius, a man who had the world at his feet but felt profoundly alone. He described Amelia as a good wife, but one who was part of the gilded cage Richard longed to escape. And then he met Isabella Rossi, Thorne declared, gesturing towards his client. A woman who saw not the billionaire but the man, an intellectual equal, a kindred spirit. Their love was not a sordid affair, ladies and gentlemen. It was a meeting of souls. Richard Sterling's final will was not an act of malice. It was his final act of love, a testament to the woman who truly knew him. Ms. Hayes's prenuptial agreement provided for her generously. This lawsuit is not born of need. It is born of greed and spite. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She walked slowly to the lectern, her presence commanding a different kind of attention, not theatrical, but intensely focused. "Marcus Thorne would have you believe this is a love story," she began, her voice calm and clear. "It is not. This is a story of predation. It is the story of a calculating woman who targeted a vulnerable married man. A woman with a history of seducing wealthy men for financial gain. A woman who, by her own admission, sees men not as partners, but as opportunities. We will prove that Isabella Rossi systematically isolated Richard Sterling from his wife and business partner, that she fed his insecurities, and that she poisoned his mind until he signed a document that betrayed the single most important legacy any man can leave his own child. This was not an act of love. It was the final move in a long and calculated con. The first few days of the trial were a brutal parade of witnesses. David Chen was called to the stand. Thorne's cross-examination was merciless. He forced David to admit that Richard had complained about his marriage, that he had felt pressured by the impending fatherhood, and that he had described his time with Isabella as the only time he felt truly alive. Each admission felt like a fresh betrayal to Amelia. When Eleanor questioned David, she focused on Richard's behavior in his final months. "Mr. Chen, did you notice a change in Richard's business practices after Ms. Rossi became a more permanent fixture in his life?" "Yes," David admitted reluctantly. "He became more impulsive. He made a couple of risky acquisitions against the board's advice. He seemed distracted, paranoid. He installed security software on all our systems because he was convinced a competitor was trying to steal his ideas." "And who recommended that software?" Eleanor asked. "Isabella," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "She introduced him to the company." Next came Richard's executive assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah. She testified that in the last year Ms. Rossi had become the gatekeeper to Richard. Calls were routed through her and meetings were scheduled or canceled based on her approval. "He called her his strategic advisor," Sarah said, "but it felt more like she was his handler." The turning point came when Eleanor called Clara, the former gallery curator, to the stand. Thorne immediately objected, arguing her testimony about Julian Croft was irrelevant and prejudicial. After a heated bench conference, the judge allowed it, but with a strict warning to the jury to consider it only as potential evidence of a pattern, not as proof of wrongdoing in this specific case. Clara recounted the story of Julian Croft, his sudden death in the will. Then Eleanor played the voicemail. Isabella's voice, younger but unmistakably hers, filled the courtroom, dripping with venom. "I won't make that mistake again. Next time I'll make sure it's all locked down before the idiot even gets a cold." A shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. Isabella's composure finally broke. Her face went white with fury, and she shot a venomous glare at the witness stand. For the first time, the jury saw the predator beneath the poise. But the final and most feared part of the trial was Amelia's own testimony. Marcus Thorne would get to cross-examine her, and she knew he would try to rip her life apart. On the stand, under Eleanor's gentle questioning, Amelia recounted her life with Richard. The good times, the love, his excitement about their son. She did not cry. She spoke with a quiet, powerful dignity. Then Thorne approached, circling her like a shark. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that you and your husband argued frequently in the last year?" "We had disagreements like any married couple. Disagreements about his work hours, about his friends. Isn't it true you told him he was becoming a self-obsessed caricature of himself during a fight just 2 months before he died?" Amelia paled. It was true. A private, painful moment was now a weapon against her. "I was upset. We were both under a lot of stress." "Stress? Or was the fairy tale ending?" Thorne pressed. "Isn't it true you were primarily concerned with the lifestyle he provided, the house, the cars, the status?" "No," Amelia said, her voice firm. I was an architect with my own career when I met him. I loved my husband. You loved him so much that when he died, your first act wasn't just to grieve, but to hire one of the most expensive lawyers in the state to sue for his money. Money he explicitly, in a legal document, left to another woman. My first act, Amelia said, her voice rising with emotion as she looked directly at the jury, her hand on her belly, was to survive. And when I found out that the man I loved had been convinced to sign away our child's future, my next act was to fight for my son. This isn't about greed. It's about a mother protecting her baby from being erased by the woman who destroyed our family. Her words hung in the silent courtroom. For the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt on the faces in the jury box. She had survived the attack. She had told her truth. Now all she could do was wait and pray that it was enough. The trial was drawing to a close. Both sides had presented their cases, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The prevailing wisdom among the legal pundits covering the case was that it was too close to call. Thorne had successfully planted seeds of doubt about Amelia's motives, while Eleanor had exposed the predatory side of Isabella. It all came down to which narrative the jury found more believable. Amelia felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for a verdict that would define the rest of her life. On the night before closing arguments, a frantic call came from Frank Miller, the private investigator. "I think I've got something big," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "It's a long shot, but you need to hear this. Remember the security software Isabella had Richard install at Nexus Dynamics, the one she recommended?" "Yes," Eleanor said, putting the call on speaker so Amelia could hear. "I've been digging into the company that makes it, a firm called Viridian Shield. It's a boutique cybersecurity outfit based in Delaware. I ran a deep corporate records search. Guess who is the primary silent investor behind the shell corporation that owns Viridian Shield?" There was a pause. "Don't tell me," Eleanor breathed. "Isabella Rossi," Frank confirmed. "She funded its creation 3 years ago with the first big payout she got from Richard's investments. The software wasn't to protect him from competitors. It was to spy on him. It would have given her remote backdoor access to everything. His emails, his financial transactions, his calendar. Everything." Amelia felt a wave of nausea. The paranoia Richard had exhibited wasn't just in his head. It had been actively manufactured by the very person he trusted most. "Can you prove it?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with urgency. "I have the incorporation documents, but proving she used it to spy is harder. The software's logs would be on Nexus Dynamics' main server. We'd need a court order to access it, and the trial is ending tomorrow." "We don't have time for an order," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "But we don't need the logs. We just need the truth." The next morning, as Isabella Rossi took the stand for a final rebuttal testimony, looking poised and confident, Eleanor approached the lectern for her cross-examination. "Ms. Rossi," Eleanor began calmly, "you've testified that your relationship with Mr. Sterling was based on mutual trust and understanding, correct?" "That's right," Isabella said, smiling serenely. "We had no secrets." "No secrets. So you would have told him, of course, that you were the secret owner of Viridian Shield, the cybersecurity company whose software you insisted he install across his entire company." The question hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Marcus Thorne shot to his feet, shouting, "Objection, Relevance Foundation!" But it was too late. The damage was done. Isabella's serene mask dissolved into a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Her eyes darted toward Thorne, a silent plea for help. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice losing its carefully modulated calm. Eleanor walked towards the witness box, holding up a document. "This is the incorporation filing for the shell company that owns Viridian Shield, Ms. Rossi. The primary investor is listed under a trust that my investigator has traced directly back to a bank account in the Cayman Islands, an account that you opened 3 years ago. Would you like me to continue?" Thorne was frantically whispering to Isabella, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at Eleanor, her face a mixture of hatred and fear. The The judge, intrigued, overruled Thorne's objection. The witness will answer the question. Mr. Sterling's paranoia about corporate espionage. That wasn't real, was it, Ms. Rossi? Eleanor pressed on, her voice like ice. You stoked those fears. You created the problem so you could sell him your solution. A solution that gave you a backdoor into every aspect of his life. You didn't just influence him with words. You monitored his every move. You read his emails to his wife. You saw his business plans. You knew exactly which levers to pull. Isn't that right? No, that's a lie, Isabella shrieked, her composure utterly shattered. He wanted my help. He was losing his edge. He needed me. He needed you, or you needed his password, Eleanor shot back. The will, Ms. Rossi. Was that his idea? Or did you just happen to see the draft of his old will on his computer and decide to help him revise it? It was the final devastating blow. By revealing the spying, Eleanor hadn't just proven undue influence. She had exposed a level of cold, calculated manipulation that bordered on criminal. Isabella's credibility, so carefully constructed over weeks of testimony, had been annihilated in under 5 minutes. She was no longer the tragic soulmate. She was a spy who had bugged the man she claimed to love. Marcus Thorne knew the case was lost. His request for a redirect was limp, and Isabella's denials were hysterical and unconvincing. In her closing argument, Eleanor didn't need theatrics. She simply laid out the facts. This was never a love affair, she told the jury. It was a corporate takeover of a human being. And like any hostile takeover, the goal was a total acquisition of assets. Richard Sterling was not a lover to Isabella Rossi. He was her target, and his son, his unborn child, was just collateral damage in her ruthless pursuit of his fortune. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Amelia looked across the courtroom at Isabella. The beautiful, confident woman was gone. In her place was a pale, trembling figure, exposed and defeated. Amelia felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness for the man who had been so blind and for the life he had so carelessly thrown away. The battle was over. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. It was a lifetime. Amelia sat with Chloe and Eleanor in the sterile courthouse waiting room, unable to speak. Every possible outcome warred in her mind. What if they lost? What would she do? Where would she go? The life of her child hung in the balance, a thought so terrifying she had to physically push it away. When the bailiff called them back into the courtroom, the silence was absolute. Amelia's hand flew to her stomach, a protective shield. Isabella Rossi and Marcus Thorne were already at their table, Isabella looking ashen. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, stood and handed the verdict to the clerk. She refused to look at the defendant's table, a detail Eleanor noted with a tiny reassuring squeeze of Amelia's arm. The clerk cleared his throat and read from the paper. In the matter of the estate of Richard Sterling, on the challenge of the will dated February 12th, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Amelia Hayes. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The clerk continued, We find that the will is invalid due to proven undue influence exerted by the defendant, Ms. Isabella Rossi. Amelia broke. The dam of composure she had maintained for months burst, and silent, hot tears streamed down her face. Chloe wrapped her arms around her, sobbing with relief. It was over. They had won. The court invalidated the new will, meaning the estate would revert to Richard's previous will, the one written after their wedding, which named Amelia as the sole beneficiary. Isabella Rossi simply stared into the middle distance, her expression blank, as if she couldn't process the words. Her empire, built on secrets and seduction, had crumbled to dust. The legal battle had not only cost her the Sterling fortune, but had exposed her past dealings, and the district attorney's office was already opening a fraud investigation against her and her company, Viridian Shield. 6 weeks later, Amelia gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She did not name him Richard. She named him Christopher, after her own father, a man of quiet integrity. It was a conscious decision to give her son a new legacy, one untainted by the scandal and secrets of his father. life slowly found a new rhythm. The silence in the Beverly Hills mansion was no longer haunting. It was filled with the gurgles and cries of a newborn. Amelia, with the help of a reconstituted board of directors, led by a deeply remorseful David Chen, took control of Nexus Dynamics. She proved to be a natural leader, her architect's mind for structure and detail translating surprisingly well to the corporate world. She was not her husband. She was more cautious, more collaborative, and more ethical, and under her guidance the company stabilized and thrived. She never became the society queen Margaret Sterling had once hoped for. Instead, she became something far more formidable, a respected businesswoman and a devoted single mother. She sold the sprawling mansion, finding it too full of ghosts, and moved into a more modest but beautiful home in a quieter neighborhood. One of her first major acts as head of the estate was to establish the Sterling Foundation, but she changed its mission. Instead of funding the flashy art projects Richard had favored, she dedicated it to supporting single mothers and providing legal aid to women fighting unjust wills and predatory relationships. She took the ugliest chapter of her life and used its power to ensure other women would not have to fight the same battles alone. Years later, a journalist asked her if she ever forgave Richard. She paused, looking out the window of her office, a picture of a smiling, gap-toothed Christopher on her desk. "I have forgiven him for his weakness," she said finally. "I have forgiven him for being manipulated. But I don't think I'll ever forgive him for the choice he made for underestimating my strength and for almost making our son pay the price. He left his fortune to the wrong woman. I'm just the one who had to prove it." She had inherited more than Richard's money. She had inherited his power, and she was determined to wield it with the wisdom and compassion he had so tragically lacked. Her fight was over, but her true legacy and Christopher's was just beginning. Amelia Hayes' story is a harrowing yet ultimately inspiring testament to a mother's resilience. It's a reminder that a person's true character isn't revealed when life is easy, but when they are stripped of everything and forced to fight for what matters most. She faced down grief, betrayal, and a hostile legal system, not for money, but for her child's right to exist. Her victory wasn't just in a courtroom. It was in rewriting her own future and turning her pain into a shield for others. What do you think was Amelia's fight about justice or revenge? What would you have done in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of strength and survival moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a story of triumph over adversity. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that need to be told. Thank you for watching.